Within hours of the news telling America that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died, came the news of what would happen to her vacated Supreme Court seat. We know tonight President Trump has said he plans to announce his choice of a nominee this Friday or Saturday.
I will be putting forth a nominee next week.
And Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that nominee will get a vote on the floor of the Senate. But he has been careful about not saying when that will happen, meaning will it be before the presidential election or after? Along party lines, the Republican Party does hold the majority in the Senate to vote in President Trump's nominee. But two Republican senators, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, have said they will not support a confirmation vote before Election Day. That means McConnell can't lose two more in his party to that line of thinking. If he does, he loses the majority to get the nominee confirmed. So what does the White House say? It says it's possible to get to a vote before November 3rd, but that ball is in McConnell's court to deal with. Now, is it really possible to get done before Election Day? Anything is possible, but if President Trump, in fact, is waiting to announce his pick later this week, it would be a confirmation at a faster pace than ever before. There are no rules, however, for how long this should or should not take once the president announces his pick. As for could the Senate wait and take this up after the election? Yes, Republicans, no matter the outcome on November 3rd, can still vote in that time post-election before any new Congress members take their posts in January. Democrats might not like that and are trying to argue that the Republican Senate majority follow a precedent they set in 2016, one that said a nominee should not get an up-down vote this close to the election. McConnell says that precedent doesn't apply this time because his party holds the Oval and the Senate majority. He says that wasn't the case in 2016.